The stars had always been there, cold and distant, watching humanity struggle and fight and claw its way out of the dirt. For thousands of years, humans looked up and wondered if anyone else was out there. They got their answer on a Tuesday morning when the alien ship appeared over Geneva and didn't bother hiding. The Galactic Council had sent a diplomatic vessel, something elegant and crystalline that hurt to look at directly. Inside were representatives from a dozen species, each one stranger than the last. They explained in careful, translated words that humanity was being invited to join the galactic community. There were rules, of course. Laws that governed trade, territory, and most importantly, warfare. Commander Jake Morrison led the human delegation. He was 42 years old, with gray already threading through his dark hair and eyes that seemed to calculate every possible angle before he spoke. The military had chosen him because he was smart, disciplined, and knew how to talk to people without making them nervous. Lieutenant Amy Collins stood beside him, a datapad in her hands and an expression that gave nothing away. She was younger, sharper, and had a habit of smiling at exactly the wrong moments. The alien called General Thross did most of the talking. He was Corvin, which meant scales and vertical pupils and a voice that clicked and hissed even through the translator. He explained how civilized species handled conflict. When disputes couldn't be resolved through negotiation, war was permitted, but it followed strict guidelines. Military targets only. No civilian casualties. Prisoners were treated with respect. And most importantly, when one side lost 30% of their forces, they surrendered. The winner claimed whatever had been disputed and both sides moved on. Jake listened without interrupting. Amy took notes. The other species in the room, the insect-like Vrex and the living crystal Lothani, watched the humans with something that might have been curiosity or might have been caution. When General Thross finished explaining, he asked if humanity understood the accords. Jake nodded slowly. Then he asked a question that made every translator in the room stutter and reset. What happens if we don't surrender? General Thross's scales rippled in what the humans would later learn was amusement. Every new species asked this question. The answer was always the same. If you don't surrender, you die. Simple mathematics. No species could sustain losses beyond 30% and remain functional. Continuing to fight was suicide, and 12,000 years of galactic history had proven that intelligence meant knowing when to stop. Jake smiled. It wasn't a friendly expression. It was the kind of smile that came right before something broke, and General Thross felt something cold settle in his gut, even though he didn't fully understand why. The meeting ended with handshakes and formal agreements. Humanity was granted provisional membership in the Galactic Council. They would be allowed to colonize certain systems, trade for technology, and learn how civilized species conducted themselves. Everyone left feeling satisfied that another primitive race had been brought into the fold. 3 weeks later, the Corvin Dominion declared war on Earth. The dispute was minor, something about a mining colony in a system both species had claimed. Under normal circumstances, it would have been resolved through arbitration, but the Corvin wanted to teach the newcomers a lesson. Show them how warfare worked in practice. Humanity needed to understand their place in the hierarchy. General Thross personally commanded the 4th Fleet, 200 warships representing the pinnacle of Corvin military power. They jumped into the disputed system expecting to find hastily constructed defenses and perhaps a few converted civilian ships. The humans would fire some shots, lose their required 30% and surrender. The Corvin would claim the mining rights. Everyone would go home. The reality was different. Jake Morrison met them with 17 ships. Not warships, not properly. Cargo haulers, fuel tankers, and colony transports that had been gutted and refitted with whatever weapons humanity could manufacture in 3 weeks. They were ugly, asymmetrical things held together with welds and desperation. General Thross broadcast the standard challenge. This was a territorial dispute under council authority. Humanity could surrender now and negotiate favorable terms, or they could fight until reaching acceptable loss thresholds. Either way, the outcome was predetermined. Jake's response came through clear and steady. No surrender, no negotiation. If the Corvin wanted the colony, they could try to take it. The battle started according to standard protocols. The Corvin fleet advanced in formation, weapons charged but not yet firing. They would target the human military installations first, precise and professional. But before they could get into optimal firing range, One of the human cargo haulers broke formation and accelerated directly at the Corvin flagship. General Thross ordered his gunners to destroy it, but the ship kept coming. It wasn't firing, wasn't maneuvering, just burning its engines at maximum thrust on a collision course. The Corvin flagship got 3 shots into it before impact. The explosion vaporized both ships instantly and sent a wave of superheated plasma and debris through the Corvin formation. 6 more ships went dark. Dozens were damaged, and the humans were already moving. Captain Ryan Fletcher commanded another freighter. When the Corvin started targeting his vessel, he didn't retreat. Instead, he locked down the navigation, vented the cargo bays full of industrial chemicals, and set a dead man's switch on the detonator. His ship drifted into the middle of the Corvin cruiser formation, before exploding with enough force to crack hulls and melt armor. General Thross couldn't understand what he was watching. Captains didn't suicide their vessels. Crews didn't voluntarily die in explosions. It violated every principle of modern warfare. It was wasteful, inefficient, and absolutely insane. Amy Collins appeared on the communication channel. Her face was calm, almost pleasant, like she was discussing something mundane instead of coordinating suicide attacks. General Thross demanded to know why humanity wasn't following the Accords. Why they were throwing away lives for no strategic gain. Amy's smile widened slightly. She explained in simple words that the Corvin had come to their system. They had threatened their colony, and now they were going to learn something that apparently 12,000 years of civilized warfare had let the galaxy forget. Humans don't surrender, she said. Not when you come to their home, not when you threaten their people. The Corvin could leave now, or they could stay and find out exactly how creative humans could get when someone backed them into a corner. General Thross looked at his tactical display. The humans had lost 12 of their 17 ships. By every calculation, they should be begging for terms. Instead, the remaining 5 vessels were accelerating toward his fleet, broadcasting something through their communication systems. Music. Loud, aggressive, rhythmic music that made no sense in the context of warfare. The Corvin tried to engage, but the human ships weren't fighting like anything they'd encountered before. No formations, no tactics, just raw aggression and a complete disregard for self-preservation. One ship lost its weapons and used its drive exhaust as a flamethrower. Another one deliberately breached its own reactor containment to create a radiation field that forced the Corvin to scatter. When the last human ship finally went down, it managed to crash into a Corvin supply tender and take it along. General Thross stared at the debris field and realized he'd won. He'd destroyed every human vessel. The colony was defenseless, but he didn't feel victorious. His fleet was scattered, damaged, and demoralized. They'd faced an enemy that fought without reason, without hope, without any regard for the established rules, and the way Amy Collins had smiled before her transmission cut out suggested that humanity had more ships coming. General Thross withdrew his fleet and sent an urgent message to the Galactic Council. Humanity was in violation of the Accords. They fought without honor. They needed to be contained before this insanity spread. The Council reviewed the combat footage in silence. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, the Lothani representative dimmed with distress and whispered something that everyone was thinking. These aren't soldiers. These are something else entirely. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session in the Great Chamber on Vraxis Prime, where representatives from 40 species gathered beneath crystalline domes that filtered starlight into something soft and civilized. They watched the footage from the first battle 3 times, and each viewing brought deeper silence. General Thross stood before them, his scales still showing stress patterns from the engagement. He explained in precise military language what had happened. The humans had violated every principle of the Accords. They had used suicide tactics. They had refused surrender at appropriate loss thresholds. They had treated their own lives as expendable resources, rather than valuable assets to be preserved. The Vrex ambassador clicked her mandibles nervously. In 12,000 years of recorded galactic warfare, no species had ever deliberately crashed their vessels into enemy ships. It was considered wasteful at best, barbaric at worst. The tactical gain was minimal compared to the cost, but the Lothani military analyst brought up something more disturbing. He projected casualty figures and resource calculations across the chamber's display systems. Yes, the humans had lost every ship, But they had destroyed or damaged 30 Corvin vessels with only 17 of their own. That was an exchange ratio that made no economic sense, but it was effective. If humanity was willing to trade one ship for two, and they had any significant industrial capacity, they could grind down any fleet through sheer attrition. The mathematics was simple and terrifying. General Thross demanded authorization for a full military response. The Corvin Dominion would assemble a fleet large enough that even human insanity couldn't overcome it. They would crush Earth's colonies, force them to surrender, and impose restrictions that prevented this madness from spreading. The Council voted in favor. 40 species agreed that humanity needed to be taught the cost of violating the Accords. Not destroyed, not yet, but defeated thoroughly enough that they would accept their place in the Galactic Order. Back on Earth, Jake Morrison stood in front of a committee of politicians and military leaders who wanted explanations. They had just lost 17 ships and every crew member aboard them. The colony was still contested. By any measure, the engagement had been a disaster. Jake disagreed. He pulled up the same footage the Council had watched and pointed out what mattered. The Corvin had retreated. Yes, humanity had lost the battle, but the enemy hadn't claimed the colony. They'd gone home to lick their wounds and reconsider their assumptions. Amy Collins added her analysis. The Corvin thought they understood human capabilities. They thought one fleet would be enough. But that hesitation, that moment of uncertainty when they realized humans would rather die than follow the rules, that was worth 17 ships. The committee wasn't convinced until Jake explained what came next. Earth had been building ships for 3 weeks. Now they had time to build more, better, and with the understanding that crew survival wasn't the primary design goal. If you stopped trying to bring people home alive, ship design became much simpler. 6 weeks later, the Corvin Grand Armada entered human space. General Thross had assembled 8,000 warships from 5 different council species. It was overwhelming force, the kind of fleet that had conquered entire sectors. He broadcast surrender terms before the first shot. Humanity could keep their homeworld but would abandon all colony claims. They would accept council oversight on their military. They would pay reparations for violating the Accords. The response came from someone new. General Paul Richards appeared on every Corvin display screen, and something about his face made experienced warriors uncomfortable. He was older than Jake Morrison, with gray hair cut military short and eyes that looked through people rather than at them. His uniform had no decorations, no medals, nothing to indicate rank except the stars on his collar. He thanked General Thross for the generous terms. Then he declined them all. The Corvin were confused. They'd brought 8,000 ships. The humans had perhaps 300 vessels, most of them converted civilian craft. The math was insurmountable. Paul Richards smiled the same way Jake Morrison had smiled in that first meeting, and General Thross felt his scales lock with instinctive dread. The battle for the colony world New Boston lasted 6 hours and redefined what the galaxy thought was possible in warfare. The humans had spent 6 weeks preparing, but not in ways that made sense to the Corvin. They hadn't built massive fleets or constructed defensive stations. Instead, they'd filled near-orbit space with thousands of small satellites, each one containing a simple kinetic impactor. Chunks of metal with basic guidance systems and just enough fuel to change trajectory. When the Corvin fleet entered the system, the satellites activated. Suddenly, 8,000 warships were navigating through a debris field where every piece of junk could punch through shields if it hit at the right angle. Fleet formations scattered. Point defense systems overloaded trying to track thousands of targets. Then the human ships arrived. Captain Danny Price led the first wave. His destroyer was built around a single massive railgun that took up 2/3 of the hull. The weapon could fire exactly 3 times before the power systems burned out. There were no crew quarters, minimal life support, and the reactor was deliberately unstable. After the 3rd shot, the ship would tear itself apart. Danny fired all 3 shots in 40 seconds, crippled 2 Corvin cruisers, and then aimed his dying ship at a carrier before the reactor went critical. The explosion caught 4 more vessels. The Corvin tried to adapt. They tightened formations to provide mutual support. The humans responded by releasing clouds of reflective chaff that blinded sensors, then sending in boarding teams, wearing nothing but vac suits, and carrying improvised explosives. The teams didn't try to capture ships. They just found the reactor cores and detonated everything at once. Colonel Lisa Hayes commanded the ground defense on New Boston. When Corvin dropships tried to land occupation forces, she did something that made the Council observers physically recoil. She ordered human military units to fall back into civilian population centers. General Thross screamed over open channels that using civilians as shields violated every accord, every principle of civilized warfare. Lisa's response was broadcast across every military frequency in the system. She wasn't using civilians as shields. She was daring the Corvin to fire on cities to get to military targets. If they wanted the planet, they'd have to burn it first. And every dead civilian would be broadcast to every Council species, showing what noble warriors did to claim territory. The Corvin hesitated. In 12,000 years, no species had ever deliberately endangered their own population as a tactical maneuver. It was supposed to be unthinkable. General Thross tried to call the bluff. He ordered precision strikes on military positions within the city of New Portland. The Corvin used their most advanced targeting systems, weapons that could supposedly hit a specific building without damaging neighbors. 3 strikes hit their targets. The 4th one, due to atmospheric interference or human jamming or simple malfunction, struck an apartment complex. 400 civilians died instantly. Lisa Hayes had cameras positioned everywhere. The footage went out on every frequency humanity could access. Burning homes, screaming children, Corvin ships in orbit, firing down on a defenseless city. The propaganda effect was instantaneous and devastating. Half the Council species immediately questioned the Corvin actions. The Lithani withdrew their fleet contingent entirely. Protests erupted on a dozen worlds. The narrative shifted from civilized species containing human barbarism to powerful invaders slaughtering innocent families. And while the galaxy argued, human forces launched counterattacks that ignored every rule. Captain Ryan Fletcher's brother, Lieutenant Ben Fletcher, led a team that infiltrated a Corvin supply depot on an asteroid base. They didn't sabotage the facility. They didn't steal supplies. They killed the garrison, all 5,000 soldiers, by turning off life support and gravity simultaneously. Then they painted messages on the walls in Corvin blood. The messages were simple. We don't surrender. We don't stop. We don't forgive. When Corvin rescue teams found the base 3 days later, they also found explosives rigged to every entrance. 200 more died in the recovery operation. General Thross demanded Council support for total war. Humanity had proven they wouldn't follow any rules, so the Corvin shouldn't be bound by them either. Glass Earth, sterilize the colonies, remove the threat permanently. The Council refused, not out of mercy but out of fear. The humans had lost 70% of their fleet in the New Boston battle. By every calculation, they should have surrendered days ago. Instead, they were fighting harder, more desperately, with creativity that bordered on artistic in its brutality. The Vrex military command ran projections. If the Council authorized total war against humanity, they would probably win. But the cost would be catastrophic. Every human ship would fight to destruction. Every colony would resist to the last civilian. And the humans were already stealing Council technology, adapting it, weaponizing it in ways that violated common sense. Paul Richards appeared on Council communication channels without authorization, hijacking their secure networks through methods their best analysts couldn't trace. His message was simple. You came to our worlds. You threatened our pew. The war had been going on for 8 months when the Galactic Council realized they had made a terrible mistake. Not in fighting humanity, though that was becoming increasingly clear, but in assuming the humans they'd met first represented the species as a whole. Jake Morrison had been a diplomat wearing a uniform. Paul Richards was something else entirely. The Council intelligence services finally accessed Earth's military records, and what they found made the VREX ambassador physically ill. Paul Richards had been in prison when the war started, not for civil crimes, but for actions during Earth's last major conflict that his own government considered too extreme. He'd won battles by methods that made his superiors uncomfortable. When peace came, they'd locked him away because people like him were dangerous when there wasn't an enemy to point them at. Then the Corvin invaded, and Earth opened the cells. Richards wasn't alone. Every human commander who'd distinguished themselves in the war so far had similar files. Lisa Hayes had been dishonorably discharged for disobeying orders during a peacekeeping mission. Danny Price's brother Ben had psychological evaluations that recommended permanent removal from active duty. Amy Collins had a sealed record that required 3 levels of clearance to access. Earth wasn't sending their best soldiers. They were sending the ones they usually kept locked up. The realization spread through Council military circles like a virus. The humans everyone feared, the ones who crashed ships and used civilians as tactical assets and painted walls with enemy blood, these were the people humanity considered too dangerous for peacetime service. The Vrex military command asked the obvious question. If these were the ones Earth considered unstable, what were the stable ones like? They never got a good answer. The war entered a new phase when human forces stopped defending and started attacking. Captain Ben Fletcher led a strike team to a Corvin mining colony on the edge of Council space. The colony was civilian, protected under the Accords, completely off-limits to military action. Ben attacked it anyway, not with warships or orbital bombardment. He landed 20 soldiers with instructions to make it personal. They spent 3 days hunting Corvin miners through the tunnels, using knives and improvised weapons. When Corvin security forces arrived, they found walls covered in tally marks and messages explaining exactly why this was happening. For New Boston. For New Portland. For every human who died because you wanted to teach us our place. The survivors told stories about humans who laughed while fighting, who seemed to enjoy the hunt. The Corvin military tried to suppress the accounts, but word spread. Human soldiers weren't just dangerous. They were wrong somehow, broken in ways that made them effective at violence. The council convened again, and this time, the debate was different. The Lithani suggested negotiation. The Vrex wanted quarantine. The Corvin demanded total war, but General Thross's voice carried less weight now. His Grand Armada had been reduced by 40%, and human forces were still operating. Paul Richards intercepted the council transmission and broadcast a response that every species received simultaneously. He appeared on screen looking tired but satisfied, like someone who'd just finished a particularly engaging puzzle. Behind him, technicians worked on captured Corvin technology, tearing it apart and rebuilding it into something new. Richards explained that humanity appreciated the council's concern. He understood they were worried about human tactics, but he wanted to clarify something. Everything the council had seen so far, every suicide run and civilian shield and brutal ground engagement, that was humanity showing restraint. The council representatives looked at each other in confusion. Restraint. Richards continued. Earth had weapons they hadn't used yet. Technologies developed during their own wars that were considered too horrible for human-on-human conflict. Biological agents that could sterilize a planet. Nanomachines that could disassemble matter at the molecular level. Artificial intelligence weapons that made decisions too quickly for organic minds to counter. Humanity had banned these weapons centuries ago, after learning the hard way what happened when you removed all limits from warfare. But bans were just agreements, and agreements could be broken if the alternative was extinction. He leaned forward with that cold smile. So the council had a choice. They could keep fighting, and humanity would start using the weapons they'd promised each other never to touch again. Or they could negotiate a peace that let everyone walk away. The transmission ended, and the council chamber erupted into debate that lasted 18 hours. Meanwhile, human forces demonstrated what Richards meant by restraint. Colonel Lisa Hayes led an assault on a Corvin military station that protected a major trade route. Instead of attacking the station directly, she released a cloud of microscopic drones that infiltrated the ventilation systems. The drones didn't kill anyone. They just made everyone sick. Violently, painfully, continuously sick. The Corvin garrison couldn't fight. They could barely stand. When human boarding teams arrived, they found hundreds of soldiers curled in corners, too weak to resist. Lisa accepted their surrender, provided medical treatment, and then broadcast footage of the operation to every Corvin military channel. The message was clear. We could have killed you all. We chose not to. This time, Captain Danny Price took what remained of his squadron to a Vrex colony world. The Vrex had contributed ships to the Grand Armada, so humanity considered them legitimate targets. But Danny didn't attack the colony. Instead, he dropped propaganda leaflets from orbit, The leaflets showed casualty figures. Vrex losses in the war. Human losses. Then they showed projections. If the war continued for another year, the Vrex would lose approximately 30% of their military fleet and 4% of their industrial capacity. This was acceptable according to Council projections, but humanity didn't care about Council projections. The leaflets explained in simple language that humans would keep fighting until the enemy stopped coming. If that meant killing every Vrex soldier, destroying every ship, burning every station, they would do it. Not because they hated the Vrex specifically, but because that's what war meant to humans. Total commitment until one side couldn't continue. The Vrex colony administrator sent the leaflets to his government with a single question. Was trade route access worth that cost? The Virex began unofficial peace negotiations within a week. Paul Richards met with Jake Morrison in a secure location on Earth's moon. Jake had been promoted to admiral, coordinating fleet movements and logistics. He looked exhausted. Paul looked energized, like the war was feeding something inside him that peacetime had starved. Jake asked if the threats were real. Did Earth actually have those weapons ready to deploy? Paul smiled and admitted the truth. Some of them were real. Some were exaggerations. Some were complete fabrications. But the Council didn't know which was which, and uncertainty was its own weapon. Besides, he said, humanity didn't need super weapons. They just needed the Council to believe humans were crazy enough to use them. And given everything they'd seen so far, why wouldn't they believe it? Jake wondered aloud if they'd gone too far. If the tactics they'd used could ever be justified. Paul's expression hardened. The Corvin came to human colonies and demanded surrender. They'd killed civilians. They'd tried to impose their rules on a species that had never agreed to follow them. Everything humanity had done was a response to invasion, but more importantly, it worked. The Council was negotiating. Species were withdrawing their forces. Humanity had gone from provisional members to a threat that even the oldest civilizations took seriously. Jake didn't argue.
He'd seen the casualty figures.
Human losses were catastrophic by Council standards, acceptable by human history. Every species in the galaxy knew Earth's military was smaller, less advanced, and outmatched in every technical category. But they also knew humans would trade 10 ships for one if necessary, and they had enough ships to make that math work. The Council's final session on the war lasted 3 days. The Corvin wanted to continue, but they were alone. The Vrex had withdrawn. The Lithani refused further support. A dozen minor species that had contributed ships to the Grand Armada were quietly negotiating separate treaties with Earth. General Thross made one last argument. If the Council showed weakness now, if they let humanity get away with violating the Accords, other species would follow. The entire system of civilized warfare would collapse. The Lithani representative responded with a question that ended the debate. Was the system worth preserving if it couldn't handle a species that fought to win? 12,000 years of galactic civilization had created rules that made war predictable, manageable, almost civilized. Species fought over resources and territory, but never to extinction. Surrender was always an option. Prisoners were treated well. Civilians were protected. But those rules only worked if everyone agreed to follow them, and humanity had never agreed. They'd been invited into a system that assumed compliance, and when tested, they'd proven that Earth's history had taught them different lessons. The vote to offer humanity a peace treaty passed with significant opposition. The terms were unprecedented. Earth would receive full Council membership and unrestricted colony rights in their sector. In exchange, human military vessels would be restricted from Council space except by invitation. The restriction wasn't. 5 years after the treaty, the galaxy was still adjusting to humanity's presence. Trade routes flourished between Earth and various Council species. Cultural exchanges happened cautiously, with humans showing genuine interest in alien art, music, and philosophy. But underneath the peaceful interactions, everyone remembered what humans had proven themselves capable of when threatened. The Corvin Dominion never fully recovered. General Thross had been removed from command and exiled to a colony world, where he spent his days writing military analyses that no one read. His replacement, Commander Vex, understood that the Corvin's best strategy was to avoid humanity entirely. 3 splinter factions had formed from the remains of the Dominion, each one blaming the others for the failed war. and each one quietly asking human advisors for military training. Earth provided instructors, but only for defensive tactics. Paul Richards made that policy clear. Humanity would teach others how to protect themselves, but they wouldn't export offensive doctrines. The galaxy had seen enough of human warfare methods. Still, the instructors who went to Corvin splinter territories brought something the aliens found disturbing. Human military doctrine wasn't just about weapons and tactics. It was about mindset, about refusing to accept defeat until physically unable to continue, about treating every battle as if personal survival depended on winning. One Corvin officer asked his human instructor, Lieutenant Carl Mason, why humans fought with such intensity. Carl's answer became legendary in military academies across the galaxy. Because we're always fighting ourselves first. The enemy in front of us is just the excuse. The Virex attempted to incorporate human tactics into their own military structure. It failed completely. Vrex soldiers were disciplined, efficient, and followed orders precisely, but they couldn't replicate the human ability to make independent decisions under pressure. When protocols failed, Vrex forces waited for new orders. When protocols failed, human forces improvised. The Virex eventually developed a hybrid model. They used traditional tactics but kept small human advisory teams attached to each fleet. When situations went wrong, the human advisors suggested options that never appeared in any manual. During a pirate raid on a Vrex trade convoy, the human advisor, Sergeant Kate Palmer, recommended something that made the Vrex commander's antennae lock with shock. She suggested ramming the pirate flagship with an empty cargo hauler. The Vrex commander pointed out this would destroy the hauler and kill its pilot. Kate smiled and explained the pilot would evacuate first. The hauler would be remotely piloted into the target. When the Vrex commander asked why they didn't just use a missile, Kate explained that missiles could be intercepted. A cargo hauler moving at full thrust was harder to stop, and the psychological impact of seeing a massive ship used as a kinetic weapon was worth the cost. The tactic worked. The pirate fleet scattered, and the Vrex commander submitted a report recommending that human advisory teams receive diplomatic immunity because their suggestions frequently violated Council warfare conventions. The Lithani took a different approach. They studied human psychology, trying to understand what made the species so effective at violence. Their researchers produced hundreds of papers analyzing human brain chemistry, cultural evolution, and historical warfare patterns. The conclusion was simultaneously simple and disturbing. Humans had evolved as social persistence predators with advanced pattern recognition and tool use. They formed strong group bonds while maintaining individual initiative. And crucially, human brains were wired to find satisfaction in overcoming challenges through creative problem-solving. War, to humans, was the ultimate problem-solving exercise. The Lithani presented their findings to the Council with a recommendation. Don't fight humans if avoidable. If unavoidable, end it quickly before they adapt. And never ever assume they'll follow predictable patterns. Jake Morrison retired from active military service and took a position as Earth's ambassador to the Galactic Council. His appointment was controversial. Half the Council species saw him as a war criminal who'd ordered suicide attacks. The other half saw him as the human who'd shown restraint when his own commanders wanted total war. Jake's first speech to the full Council lasted 12 minutes and set the tone for human diplomatic relations going forward. He started by acknowledging that humanity had violated the Accords during the war. They'd used tactics considered barbaric. They'd endangered their own civilians. They'd refused surrender at appropriate thresholds. All of this was true, but he continued, humanity had never agreed to the Accords. Earth had been invited to join the Council and told to follow rules they had no part in creating. When conflict arose, they'd been expected to fight according to standards that made no sense from a human perspective. The galaxy spent 12,000 years creating a system where war was predictable and limited. Earth spent 10,000 years learning that war was unpredictable and total. These weren't compatible philosophies, so humanity offered a compromise. They would respect Council space and follow Council rules within that space. But in human territory, human rules applied, and anyone who came to human space looking for a fight would get one by human standards. The speech ended with Jake suggesting that perhaps the galaxy needed to remember something. Peace wasn't the absence of violence. It was the choice not to use violence even when you could. And humanity could That should make everyone more comfortable, not less. The council accepted the compromise because they didn't have better options. Amy Collins took command of the ESS Horizon. Now a proper warship instead of a diplomatic vessel, she patrolled the boundaries between human and council space, responding to distress calls and maintaining order. Her reputation preceded her everywhere she went. There was an incident 6 months into her command that demonstrated why council ships gave her a wide berth. A group of pirates, mixed species with stolen military hardware, attacked a civilian transport in disputed space. The transport sent a distress signal. Amy arrived with the Horizon and 2 escort frigates. She offered the pirates one chance to surrender. They responded by firing on the Horizon and trying to finish off the transport before jumping away. Amy didn't chase them. Instead, she tracked their jump signature, calculated their destination, and arrived at their base 3 hours before they did. When the pirate ships jumped into their home system, they found the Horizon waiting with weapons charged. Amy broadcast on open channels. She explained that the pirates had attacked civilians under Earth's protection. This meant they'd chosen to fight by human rules. She gave them 60 seconds to abandon their ships and surrender. The pirate captain, a Corvan exile named Drax, laughed over the communication channel. One human ship against his entire fleet. He ordered his forces to destroy the Horizon. What happened next was recorded by automated systems and became required viewing at council military academies. Amy didn't engage the pirate fleet directly. Instead, she launched every missile the Horizon carried, over 200 warheads, but none of them were aimed at ships. They targeted the asteroid base where the pirates lived, the fuel depots that supplied their fleet, and the communication relays that coordinated their operations. The pirates had 30 seconds to watch their entire infrastructure explode before Amy opened fire on their ships. The battle lasted 4 minutes. The Horizon was designed by humans, which meant it prioritized firepower over crew comfort. Amy's ship had weapons that would have required 3 Corvan cruisers to match. When the pirates tried to scatter, the escort frigates cut off escape routes. Amy accepted surrender from the survivors and delivered them to council authorities. Her report was clinical and professional. The pirates had attacked civilians. She had eliminated the threat. Standard procedure. The council quietly noted that standard human procedure would have been considered a war crime under the Accords. Destroying civilian infrastructure, even pirate infrastructure, wasn't acceptable by galactic standards. Amy's response became famous. If the pirates wanted to be treated as legitimate combatants under the Accords, they shouldn't have attacked civilians. They chose to operate outside the law, so they got human justice instead of council justice. No one filed an official complaint. Paul Richards remained on Earth as Supreme Commander of all human military forces. He rarely traveled, preferring to coordinate strategy from a secure facility beneath Geneva, but his reputation grew with each passing year. There were stories about what happened when council species got too aggressive with human traders or colonists. Nothing that violated the treaty, but small incidents that suggested human military forces were watching everything that happened in their territory. A Vrex merchant tried to cheat human colonists on a mining deal. His ship experienced mysterious engine failures that required expensive repairs. A Lothani researcher tried to steal human military technology. His entire research facility's computers crashed simultaneously, wiping decades of work. A Corvan faction attempted to establish a colony in a system Earth had claimed. They arrived to find human ships already there, and when they protested, Paul Richards personally appeared on their communication channels. His message was brief. The treaty gave humanity unrestricted colony rights in their sector. This system was in that sector. The Corvan could leave voluntarily or 20 years after first contact, the galaxy had settled into an uneasy equilibrium with humanity at its center, not because Earth had the largest fleet or the most advanced technology, but because every species understood that humans calculated costs differently than everyone else. The Galactic Council had expanded to include humanity as a full permanent member with veto power. The decision was practical rather than honorary. Any major military action required council approval, and no one wanted to risk humans deciding the vote wasn't binding. Jake Morrison was 70 years old now, still serving as Earth's primary ambassador, though he'd trained successors who handled most daily diplomacy. He spent his time writing, documenting humanity's perspective on the war and its aftermath. His memoirs were bestsellers on 40 different worlds, translated into languages that human mouths couldn't pronounce. The most popular chapter was titled, What We Learned About Ourselves. Jake wrote honestly about humanity's capacity for violence, about how easy it had been to find volunteers for suicide missions, about the creativity humans showed when asked to hurt enemies efficiently. He didn't glorify it or apologize for it. He just explained that Earth's history had produced a species exceptionally good at organized violence, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. But the chapter also discussed what happened after the war. How those same volunteers struggled with peacetime, how many of the commanders who'd been celebrated as heroes had quietly returned to prison or psychiatric treatment once the fighting stopped, how Amy Collins had resigned her commission after 15 years because she couldn't trust herself in command anymore. The galaxy read these accounts with fascination and horror. The idea that humans would use their most damaged individuals for warfare, then lock them away again during peace, seemed cruel. But Jake explained it was necessary. The traits that made someone effective in combat, the willingness to sacrifice anything for victory, those same traits made people dangerous when there wasn't an enemy to fight. Paul Richards was 83 and had died the previous year. His funeral was attended by dignitaries from every council species, including 3 who'd fought against him. The Corvin sent General Thross, who was 90 and barely mobile. After the ceremony, Thross approached Jake and asked a question that had haunted him for 2 decades. Had Paul Richards actually been insane, or had it all been strategy? Jake considered the question carefully. He explained that Paul had been both perfectly sane and fundamentally broken. War had given him purpose and focus. Peace had left him adrift. The tactics that seemed crazy to the council had made perfect sense to Paul because he understood something most humans spent their lives trying to forget. Sometimes the only way to stop a threat is to become a bigger threat yourself. Thross nodded slowly, his scales showing patterns of understanding mixed with sadness. The Corvin had spent 20 years trying to understand how they'd lost to an inferior force. The answer was simple but hard to accept. They'd been fighting to win according to rules. Humans had been fighting to survive despite rules. Amy Collins had left military service and spent 5 years traveling the galaxy alone. She eventually settled on a Lothani colony world, where she taught self-defense to refugees from various conflicts. Her students were civilians who'd lost homes to piracy or territorial disputes. She taught them human tactics but also human philosophy. The first lesson was always the same. You can't win every fight, but you can make every fight expensive enough that enemies look for easier targets. Her students learned to think like humans, not about honor or military protocol, but about leverage and psychology. A weak enemy who fights dirty is often more trouble than they're worth. That was humanity's real weapon, she explained, not strength, but the willingness to make victory painful enough that aggressors chose to attack someone else instead. The Lothani authorities were initially concerned about a human teaching violence to civilians. But after 5 years, refugee attacks on that colony dropped by 90%. Word spread that the refugees there knew human techniques, and criminals found easier prey elsewhere. Amy received offers to teach at military academies across the galaxy. She declined them all. Professional soldiers didn't need her lessons. They already knew how to fight. It was the vulnerable populations who needed to learn that fighting back was possible. A new generation of humans grew up in a galaxy where Earth was respected and feared. They attended council schools, learned alien languages, and formed friendships with species their parents had fought. But they also learned Earth's history in mandatory classes that didn't sugarcoat humanity's violent past. Lieutenant Kevin Shaw was 25 and commanded a patrol frigate on the edge of human space. His parents had both served during the war. His mother had died in the battle for New Boston. His father had survived but never talked about what he'd done. Kevin represented the new generation of human officers. They'd been trained in both council protocols and human tactics. They understood the accords and respected them within council space. But they also understood that in human territory, different rules applied. There was an incident that tested whether the new generation had learned the right lessons. A council exploration vessel, Frex-operated, entered human space without authorization. They were surveying a system that Earth had claimed but not yet colonized. The Vrex captain claimed they didn't realize it was human territory. The charts were unclear. Kevin intercepted them with his frigate and explained politely that they were in violation of human territorial claims. The Vrex captain argued. The system had no human presence. Under council law, claims required active settlement. Kevin listened patiently, then explained that council law didn't apply in human space. The treaty was clear. The Vrex had two options: leave immediately, or explain to their government why they'd started a diplomatic incident over survey data. The Vrex captain, younger than Kevin and probably pressured by his superiors to get good survey information, made a mistake. He suggested that one human frigate couldn't actually force them to leave. Kevin's response became a teaching case at both council and human academies. He didn't threaten. He didn't posture. He simply broadcast the current situation to both Vrex and human authorities simultaneously, making it officially logged. Then he sent a private message to the Vrex captain explaining the consequences. If the Vrex stayed, Kevin would have to escalate to his superiors. They would send more ships. The situation would become political. Both sides would be forced to take positions to avoid looking weak. What started as a minor survey mission would become a diplomatic crisis, or Kevin suggested the Vrex could leave now. Kevin would log their departure as cooperative. No one's reputation suffered. No escalation needed. The Vrex captain left. Kevin's report to his superiors was 2 sentences. Vrex vessel entered claimed space. Resolved through diplomatic communication. His commanding officer sent back a single word: approved. The incident never appeared in official records, but it demonstrated something important. The new generation of human officers had learned both parts of their heritage: the capacity for violence when necessary, but also the judgment to know when violence wasn't the best solution. The Galactic Council commissioned a study on humanity's long-term impact on galactic civilization. The results were complex and contradictory. Trade had increased. Piracy had decreased. Military innovation had accelerated as species tried to counter human tactics. Cultural exchange flourished, but warfare had changed fundamentally. Species that had spent 12,000 years fighting by rules suddenly had to consider what happened if an enemy didn't follow them. Military academies taught human tactics as alternative strategies. Young officers across the galaxy learned to think like humans, even if they hoped never to fight like them. The Corvin fragmentation was blamed on human influence. 3 factions fighting each other using human-trained advisors and human-inspired tactics. The casualties were higher than traditional Corvin warfare. The battles more brutal. Critics argued that humanity had corrupted galactic civilization. Defenders pointed out that the Corvin factions were fighting over legitimate grievances that had been suppressed under the Dominion. Human tactics didn't create the conflict. They just made it messier and more visible. Jake Morrison addressed the controversy in his final speech to the council at age 75, announcing his retirement. "Humanity didn't change the galaxy," he said. "We just reminded everyone what was always possible. For 12,000 years, you built a system based on the assumption that everyone would follow the rules, because breaking them was irrational. We proved that rationality depends on what you're trying to achieve. If your goal is limited victory at acceptable cost, the accords make sense. If your goal is survival regardless of cost, they don't. Both approaches are rational depending on context. So yes," he continued, "humanity made the galaxy more dangerous, but we also made it more honest. Species don't follow the accords now because they have to. They follow them because it's genuinely the best option. And when it's not the best option, they have human precedent for trying something else. That's not corruption," Jake concluded. "That's evolution." The speech received mixed reactions, but no one could argue with the results. 20 years after the war, the galaxy was more complicated, more